Video recordings of this podcast can be found on raisingequity.org and Raising Equity on YouTube.
Hey folks, it's DrKira Banks, and welcome to Raising Equity. In today's diversity download, I want to talk about what happens after the diversity training. Everyone is asking for DEI training sessions, and so you had a session, so you had a seminar, a training, a series. Now what? I think it's really important, even before you have a series of trainings, to be clear why. Where does it fit in your larger DEI plan? Who is it targeting? I know so often organizations just jump to doing a training because it makes them feel like they're doing something and it can show that they're doing something, but sometimes it's just minutia. I want you to really have a clear sense of why and how does it fit. So a training is best deployed when it fits in a larger strategy. Sometimes I'll talk to organizations and they'll want me to come in and do a training, but I'll talk to them and understand that their leadership hasn't articulated a clear why this work is important, why they should invest the time and energy as employees in paying attention to this training that they're bringing in. And so I say no. I'm sure you can find someone who could do it, but I don't think it's the best use of your time. So once you've figured out your why, you've articulated why, you might feel like your leadership needs some specific training, or the general organization needs to have some shared language and common understanding. And so the training can help to build that common vocabulary so that you can start doing particular work around DEI together. That's a reason to do it. But once you have it, you've got to do something with the information. And so I think the first thing is that you want to figure out how to put the content into practice. So if you have a training on understanding microaggressions and how you might interrupt them, then you got to figure out how are you going to practice what you learned in the training. So it's not just about hearing new ideas and listening, but how are you going to put them into action? What new behavior are you going to engage in? And how is that then going to get integrated into the work that the organization already does? Because if DEI is just about a training that people go to and it doesn't get brought into their work, it's not going to stick. It's not going to be effective. It's really a waste of your money and a waste of people's time. And so you don't want to start that pattern where people feel like, okay, the organization needs to show that they're doing something. We're going to have a training. So you want to commit to either having a plan for how you're going to put the content into practice, or asking the attendees, how should we? What are some examples of how we're going to put it into practice? Let's commit to each other and check back in 30 days, how we're doing, what's worked, and maybe share some next practices. Notice I didn't say best practices, next practices. And I say that because if we're honest, our best practices have gotten us where we are. We need to be thinking about what are the next practices that can take us further. So I said, put it into context, or put it into practice, put the content into practice, integrate the content into your work. And so that might mean maybe there's another initiative that you're working on that you can kind of merge or use as a place of practice for your DEI work. Perhaps there's an initiative that's going on around like decision making and how you do decision making in the organization, or development, professional development for employees. Both of those topics you could think about with a racial equity lens, an equity lens, a DEI lens, however you're framing it in your organization. So if you can get a site of practice for the content, that's really great, because then you're putting it into practice, integrating it into something that is already part of the organization. So it doesn't feel like it's siloed, and it doesn't just feel like an add-on, that it really gets woven and integrated so that it stays on the radar and stays a priority in some way. Because that's what often happens, is that people have all this hype leading up to a training, and then it kind of like there's a cliff, and it's no longer a priority because the training's done. Look, we did it. But the after the training plan is just as important as why you're doing it and what's involved and what the content is. And the last thing I'll say, after you engage in some series of trainings or sessions around DEI, you want to put the content into practice and then have some touch points where you communicate how it's going. So oftentimes out of a series of sessions, there's a call or a recommendation for leadership to consider, like I've mentioned, in terms of professional development. Oftentimes organizations realize it's actually not that we can't recruit and hire folks of color, folks who've been overlooked historically in some ways. It's that we can't keep them, we can't retain them because we haven't created the climate or culture for people to want to stay. And so a big part of a lot of the sessions is having some of these revelations around what's happening in the climate and the culture and the built landscape of the organization. And so if those are unearthed, whatever it is, those aha moments during the training, it's really incumbent upon leadership to take those aha moments, those revelations, and then do something about it, right? When you put it into practice, maybe you start by just simply tracking how many leadership development opportunities come across the desk of the executive team in the next month. And then how did you go about figuring out who was going to be invited to those opportunities? And so you could just start by analyzing, understanding how you're doing what you're doing. Before you even intervene, you'll have a baseline. And then look at the pattern to say, oh gosh, well, it looks like we ended up inviting mostly folks who, had an opportunity to be a part of this emerging leaders program, or you'll notice that there's some sort of pattern, or it's someone's direct report, and so we actually need to go a layer down to build new talent. And whatever it is, you want to understand the baseline and where you are, and then say, okay, well, let's try doing something different. Whether it's how we share the opportunities, or being more thoughtful as a team and making sure we are all talking about how we can expand and not just ask the same handful of folks that are kind of a known quantity and a proven entity, and that that they'll succeed and do it well. And so that's just an example of how you might play around or try to practice and put some of the content into practice while listening to what came up in the session. But then you have to communicate that back to the broader staff to say, hey, y'all, remember a month ago or so, we had this session. Here are some of the things that came up. Here's what we've been working on. Because too often there's kind of crickets and people feel like, well, okay, we did that. Now what's being done? And sometimes there's actually really diligent, important, and thoughtful, intentional work happening, but we don't communicate it. And so what ends up happening is we end up kind of shooting ourselves in the foot that we created hype around this visible initiative, but then we're not making visible the more invisible work that is so important in building an infrastructure for equity and for people to have access and opportunity. So I just wanted to quickly share some thoughts as I've been meeting with different organizations, and they want these sessions and they want these trainings, and other organizations that I am working with, and we're doing a series of sessions over time, that part of the work after every session is following up with leadership to say, all right, what did you hear? What's actionable? How are you going to integrate it? What does sustainability look like? You can't pick up every idea, but what can you pick up? And then how are you going to communicate it back to show your commitment? So those are just a few thoughts for my diversity download. You can find me anywhere you find your podcast. You can find me at DrKira Banks on Facebook and Instagram, Kira Banks on Twitter, and at my website, kirabanks.com. I thank you for joining me on Raising Equity.